This is going to be PowerPoint number 3 for Chapter 6. The title of this PowerPoint is American History, Unit 3, Lecture 3, the Jefferson Presidency. So the election of 1800 was a heated and close election between, once again, John Adams, the Federalist Party, and Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican Party. The Electoral College votes result in a tie between Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who was his running mate. The House, so if no one achieves, or if no one achieves this certain amount of electoral votes, or if the electoral votes is in a tie, then the House of Representatives votes. And this is true today. So for example, if the president, whoever is running for president in today's terms, if they don't achieve 270 electoral votes, which it is today, then the president essentially gets handpicked by the House of Representatives. Some of people might see this as unfair because the House of Representatives is usually either Democrat or Republican, or has the majority of Democrats or Republicans. So obviously, whichever party is in control, usually that's whose party is going to win the presidency. And in this situation, the House votes 36 times, and finally Alexander Hamilton persuades the House of Representatives to vote for Jefferson. And you might say, well, isn't Hamilton and Jefferson, aren't they on opposite ends of the spectrum? Well, yes, they are. So the election of 1800, the 12th Amendment requires separate ballots for president and vice president, and it addresses this issue. So the election is nicknamed the Revolution of 1800, and we do see a transfer of power because the Federalists are no longer in control, and now the Democratic Republicans start to become in control of, obviously, the presidency with Thomas Jefferson and Congress. And the precedent is set for a peaceful transfer from one party to another, meaning a new party is taking control. So the Federalists were in control because John Adams was the second president, but now the third president of the United States is Thomas Jefferson. And even though they are different political parties, different ideologies, there is a peaceful transfer of power. So Jefferson's presidency becomes, or how he terms, and remember, he is an ally of the French, so he uses this French term called laissez-faire. Laissez-faire can be described or to be defined as a hands-off, a hands-off approach. To quote Jefferson, it says, "Every government degenerates when trusted to the rulers of the people alone. The people themselves, therefore, are its only safe depositories." So what does Jefferson do while he's in power as president? He reduces the size of the army. He cuts taxes or reduces taxes. He also cuts expenses, and he reduces the size and the power of the national bank. So with all that said, though, he also expands westward, and we'll talk about westward expansion, which is kind of hypocritical of him because he likes to downsize and have, less is more. But he did expand our borders, and we'll talk about that. There were what was something called the Barbary Wars that took part during Jefferson's presidency. These pirates would disrupt American shipping over in the Mediterranean Sea, and they captured merchant ships and held the sailors at hostage and held these goods at hostage over in Tripoli, in northern Africa, and in the Mediterranean. So there was kind of a quasi-war with these pirates in these different countries, and Thomas Jefferson had to navigate that during his presidency as well. An important Supreme Court decision came down, and this Supreme Court case is famously named Marbury versus Madison. So this becomes about a term called judicial review. So judicial review is established in the Supreme Court case called Marbury versus Madison. So John Adams, who was the outgoing president, decides that he is going to appoint federal judges to the bench on his last day in office. Remember, you are selected president in November, and then there is a transition period from November until January. But at this point, I think it was all the way until March. So, even though Adams lost the presidency, there was a transition period from November till March back then. And then Thomas Jefferson, the new president, wouldn't take office until March. So a few years later, November to March, that's quite a long time. So in that time period, John Adams, the outgoing president, appoints federal judges. Well, these federal judges are going to be Federalist judges, and they're going to side with John Adams on different opinions. And Thomas Jefferson, who's a Democratic Republican, did not want that. So Thomas Jefferson, when he takes office, refuses to recognize these appointments because they were made on John Adams's last day. So the next day, Thomas Jefferson says no. So this case comes up, Marbury versus Madison, leads to judicial review. Marbury was one of these gentlemen that received his job as a judge from Adams, and James Madison was the person that did not give him his job, and James Madison worked for Thomas Jefferson as president. So that's why. So Marbury sued Madison because Madison was supposed to give him this job, but Madison didn't because Thomas Jefferson told him not to because he didn't like that Adams appointed Marbury on his last day in office. So judicial review, the precedent was set that the Supreme Court can declare law unconstitutional. John Marshall was the Chief Justice, and he makes the ruling, over this case on judicial review. Louisiana Purchase. So talking about westward expansion, Thomas Jefferson's greatest success as president was purchasing the Louisiana Territory from France. So if you look at the map there, the Louisiana Territory, that squiggly line that separates the brown parts of America with the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase is that white part. That squiggly line is the Mississippi River, and the Louisiana Purchase is that whole big tract of land, and they purchased that in 1803. It doubles the size of the United States overnight. However, a lot of people question Thomas Jefferson and it's nowhere in the Constitution, but the constitutionality about could you buy land and was that constitutional or not. And it was in strict conflict with Jefferson's idea about small government. Keep everything small, reduce the size of this, reduce the size of that, when in fact he doubled the size of the United States overnight by purchasing this land from Napoleon. So the exploration of Louisiana, Lewis and Clark were appointed to explore this new territory. You can see the map of what they traveled, of how they traveled across the continent or across the United States. They were helped by Sacagawea, a Native American guide. This 2-year voyage to the Pacific proves that transcontinental travel is possible. So they obviously went past the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase into what was previously occupied by actually Great Britain. So that gray area, the green area in this map, is the Louisiana Purchase, but the gray area is actually what Great Britain has at this time. And then we see the Spanish territory. The gray area was also kind of uncharted territory as well. Great Britain held some stuff in Canada at this time. So a little bit about Lewis and Clark and Louisiana Purchase. Foreign affairs. Thomas Jefferson seeks neutrality in conflict between Britain and France, meaning he and the United States decided to be neutral, and the British begin a thing called impressment, where they would seize U.S. sailors suspected of deserting British ships. So what happened was British sailors were capturing U.S. merchant ships and holding them hostage, and that was called impressment. In 1807, Thomas Jefferson pushes what is called the Embargo Act, which cut all trade with Britain and France. He did that because of the impressment, and that was his biggest mistake as president. An embargo is a cancel of trade in and out with a country. We have an embargo with Cuba today, all right, and where we don't trade with Cuba in or out. Obviously, we do still trade with Britain and France today, so that embargo didn't last very long. Conflict emerges. So impressment angers Americans. Obviously, Americans are getting captured by the British. So in 1811, William Henry Harrison defeats Tecumseh, who was a Native American chief, and the Shawnee at the Battle of Tippecanoe. So the reason this even started was because Native Americans Americans found Native Americans to have British-made rifles. So Americans thought that the British were supplying the Native Americans with rifles to rebel against the United States. Okay, so a lot of people were upset about this, and people in Congress and citizens of the United States were called war hawks because they wanted to go to war with Great Britain over this issue. The hope was to gain land in Canada and elsewhere. So these war hawks wanted to claim land that Britain had north of the Great Lakes into Canada. And this conflict begins in Thomas Jefferson's term, but spills over, and James Madison will become the um, fourth president of the United States, and he'll have to deal with this issue.